So now we get to scandal. Okay, Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton, and impeachment. So in the 1990s, we see the continuation of this personalizing politics, of making politicians' personal lives more directly open targets for political campaigns. We saw that a little bit in the very ugly and personal campaigning in 1988, and it continues throughout the 1990s. Media becomes increasingly focused on politicians' private lives. And this comes up in 1991 when Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was undergoing hearings to be placed on the Supreme Court and was plagued by accusations of sexual harassment by law professor Anita Hill. And so the hearings on whether Thomas should be confirmed were also talking about these allegations of misconduct against Thomas, although Thomas was confirmed anyways. Then there's this notion of an investigation into the Clintons. In 1993, there's an investigation of a real estate deal in Arkansas called Whitewater. And there's this question over whether the Clintons profited illegally in this deal. Kenneth Starr had been appointed to investigate Whitewater, but what was initially a targeted investigation over one real estate deal became a general investigation into misconduct, including a sexual harassment claim filed in 1994 by Paula Jones. And then eventually, Starr will discover an affair with a young White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Starr, once he learns of the affair between Bill Clinton and the White House intern Monica Lewinsky, will focus almost obsessively on it. And Starr's investigation report triggered the House to vote to impeach Clinton on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Clinton is probably the only person to ever define oral sex as not sex, as he declared on the stand he did not have sex with that woman, though she did give him blowjobs. And Clinton then went to trial in the Senate, because remember, how impeachment works is the House launches an investigation to see whether there's enough evidence of wrongdoing. They will file allegations of charges, in this case, 2 counts of impeachment, perjury, and obstruction of justice. And then once the House does that, then there has to be a trial in the Senate to weigh on whether the person is in fact guilty. Remember, it doesn't have to be a president. It can be a vice president. It can be a Supreme Court justice. It can be any other kind of federal level employee, right, that goes up for impeachment. So the Senate is responsible for holding a trial and voting on whether to convict the person, in which case they're removed from office, or whether to acquit them, in which case they are still impeached but remain in office. Clinton, when the Senate trial happened, ended up not being found guilty. He was acquitted, in part because the Senate and most Americans in public opinion polls at the time were very appalled at this notion that Clinton could be impeached for personal misconduct. They said, don't get us wrong, he's a dog. He's cheating on his wife. He's having an affair in the White House. But is that reason enough to remove him from office for personal misconduct? So Clinton is not, in fact, removed from office, but he remains impeached. So going into the 2000 election, the Clinton saga is fresh in people's minds. Clinton is term limited, so he can't run again even if he wanted to. And his vice president, Al Gore, will run as the Democratic nominee, with Joseph Lieberman as his running mate. For the Republican Party, they choose George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush and a Texas governor. Bush chooses Dick Cheney as his running mate, his dad's old Secretary of Defense. And then, as a third-party candidate, we have Ralph Nader running for the Green Party. Nader had a long history of being a consumer advocate, and So we have three candidates in this presidential election, with Nader appealing to people who were on a little bit more of the left or liberal side of the Democratic Party, and therefore siphoning some votes away from Al Gore. In the 2000 election, the popular vote is extremely close. Al Gore wins the popular vote by 0.005%. That's it. Not even a full percent, 0.005%. But we all know it's not the popular vote that wins you the presidency. It's the Electoral College. And the Electoral College vote was close too, and the race came down to Florida. Confusion reigned in Florida, however. Wildly different polling and voting technology in Florida threw results into doubt. And the Florida Supreme Court, because of this, and because of the closeness of the race, ordered a hand recount of votes that could not be easily read by machines. So if you've ever heard the phrase hanging Chad, this is a vote with a mechanical punch where the punch didn't clearly go all the way through. Okay. So the case gets kicked to the federal Supreme Court because at this point in time, the vote was before the recount leaning towards Bush. So the Republican Party escalates this, and the Supreme Court hears the case of Bush v. Gore in 2000. The Supreme Court ordered a stop to the recount and allowed the governor of Florida to call the election for George W. Bush. The governor of Florida happened to be George W. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, but I'm not alleging misconduct there. What is weird, though, is the logic that the Supreme Court used for the ruling. According to the justices, the Equal Protections Clause argued that all votes should be counted by the same standard, which was very difficult to do, in fact, impossible to do, because Florida had so many different voting technologies across the state of Florida. So not all Floridians were voting with the same technology by the same means anyways. But the Supreme Court, in a narrow ruling 5-4, declared that to go on with this hand recount would be a violation of this notion of voting with the same standard. And so therefore, the current leader, George W. Bush, was declared the winner of the Florida Electoral College votes and thus the winner of the election. So when we look at the election of 2000, we see how divided Americans really are for the first time in recent history. The popular vote almost exactly split down the middle. The Electoral College vote almost exactly split down the middle as well. It was 271 to 266. Bush succeeded in the South, in the West, and in rural areas, whereas Gore was more popular in the Northeast, the Midwest, the West Coast, and urban areas. And Gore was also more popular among women. Women supported the Democrats by an 11% lead, which was a change from elections before 1960, when women tended to vote more Republican. Today, we still observe the gender gap for the most part in presidential elections in favor of the Democrats. And the campaign cost $1.5 billion. Both candidates used public relations techniques to emphasize a moderate position, avoiding talking about major and potentially divisive issues. But at the same point in time, as contentious as this election was, it did also reveal a lot of Americans who were very disengaged politically. Less than half of registered voters actually participated in the election of 2000. And that's in the national election cycle. When we look at those who voted not just for president, but also for their state and local races on the same ballot, only 20 to 30% of registered voters voted in state and local elections. And this is a trend that still continues today. We get very excited if we see even 20 to 30% in local elections. In El Paso, Texas, where I am currently, we get really excited if the turnout for a local or state election exceeds 10%, because it's usually about 8. Okay, so this sense of people being frustrated with politics and not exercising their right to vote, we see this trend happening in the 2000 election too. So as we get into a brand new century, the year 2000, it's important to consider how far we've come from the beginning of this class material. Compared to 100 years before in 1900, life expectancy rose drastically. In 1900, Americans were lucky to see their 50s, with most Americans living to only about 46 or 48 years old. But by the year 2000, life expectancy had improved, so the average American was living until they were 74 or 79. Things like plumbing and electricity were now the norm for most Americans, whereas in 1900 they had been luxuries. And the rate of college education amongst Americans had tripled since 1960, largely as a legacy of the GI Bill post World War II and also increasing affordability and accessibility of college. But while America had made a lot of gains in the past 100 years, there were still some areas in which the United States fell behind. The United States still had a large rate of poverty and income inequality amongst developed nations. It still had a fairly high infant mortality rate amongst developed nations. And today, the United States is one of only 2 nations in the world to not have any kind of parental leave for new parents. No formal government policy for that, and Americans still are relatively lacking when it comes to paid sick days or vacation guarantees under federal laws as well. Freedom had become increasingly defined as individual pursuit of happiness. So not necessarily this economic freedom, right, or control over your workplace or your pace of work, not participation in the vote and democracy, not social justice, but instead pursuing your own happiness. So as we enter the year 2000, Americans are fairly optimistic in what this new century will bring. Maybe we'll get flying cars by the end of the 2000s, but most Americans are looking forward to the future with optimism. That's all going to come to a screeching halt in 2001 with the attacks on the United States on September 11th. We're going to talk next time about that, about how that drastically reshapes the direction of U.S. foreign policy and helps to shape the reality we live in today. We're also going to talk about how the September 11th terrorist attacks are not isolated, that there were early warning signs before then that terrorism was going to become an important concern for the United States in the new millennium. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.